Okay. We'll just let some people keep trickling in, but I'll get started so that we're not keeping everyone late tonight. So we'll just ask everybody to stay muted if you're not asking questions so that we limit background noise. And Catherine will be monitoring the chat if you want to ask any questions in there. And welcome everybody to our Birds of Newfoundland series. We're talking about ducks and loons tonight, so I'm excited to have you all here. It's great to see a good crowd out again, and yeah, I'm pretty excited to go through tonight's birds. My name is Jenna McDermott, for those of you who haven't met me before. I work for an organization called Birds Canada. And Catherine Dale, who's on the call as well, who I just mentioned, she also works for Birds Canada. And Birds Canada is a nonprofit organization that is nationwide. So we have offices and programs all across Canada. Our mission is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And to do this, we have a lot of different programs across the country that heavily rely on citizen scientists to help collect information and become involved with conserving birds. So across the country, there's over 70,000 volunteers with Birds Canada that are sort of putting their effort and their time into collecting data on the birds that they love and funneling them into our citizen science programs. So right now in Newfoundland, we are running two different programs. The first one that I'll speak about is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. We will be having a webinar at the end of this series about the Atlas, so you can definitely sign up for that one if you want more in-depth information. But the basis of it is that we are intending to map the distribution and abundance of all of the bird species that breed on the island of Newfoundland. And so you can see an example of what this looks like for the map of the American black duck that I have up here. Basically, all of the squares with color in them are places where American black ducks have been found in the last 3 years of this project. So this project is really carried out by volunteer citizen scientists, like I was mentioning. And so anybody can submit data into the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. So if you've seen any ducks, for example, with ducklings in the spring or summer, that's all information that can go onto maps like this and really help us understand where the birds are living here on the island. I'll have our contact information at the end of the webinar that you can always reach out by email to get more information on this. We are also running the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey here. And the owl survey will be actually ramping up in just a couple of months. It's another citizen science project where you can sign up for a route that you drive with your car, and in one evening in April and May, you go out and listen to hear which owls are calling. So it's really quite exciting, especially when you have some owls calling back to you. And we're always looking for volunteers to survey routes that are already existing or to create new ones. So you can reach out if you're interested in that one as well. I would like to say that the lands that the Breeding Bird Atlas occurs on are the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose people have been erased forever. And additionally, I'd like to acknowledge the island of Newfoundland as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq people. And these people have been protecting and stewarding the land here since time immemorial. Through the work of the Breeding Bird Atlas, we are hoping to assist in the stewardship, protecting all of the species that we share this island with. Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems. And we support the needs, aspirations, and rights of Indigenous peoples to care for the land. If you are interested in learning about what ancestral lands you're living on, I would recommend going to nativeland.ca as a good starting place, so you can check out a map of where different territories are located, as well as the treaties on them. Just before we get started, I'd like to take a quick second to thank all of our partners and funders who help us bring our projects to fruition in Newfoundland here. So I'll just send a thank you to them, and also to all of you who continue to come to our events and make this such a good community to be in. So for tonight, we are, as you know, going to be talking about Newfoundland's ducks and loons, or loon, I suppose I should say. We are going to be focusing on the birds that nest in Newfoundland. In the winter, we do get more ducks coming at times than the ones that actually nest here. And in all of the pictures that I'll be showing adults in breeding plumage just for ease of identification. That being said, winter is actually a really good time to practice your duck identification, because a lot of the ducks that are often farther out or hidden in the summer are found right now in the open water around Newfoundland, in any open water in the ocean or also inland. So it's a good time to get a look at a lot of ducks and get some practice with them. However, as I mentioned, there are a few extra species sometimes around in the winter, or lookalike species, and I'll mention some of those as we go through tonight. So just to start off, I'll cover the one loon species that breeds in Newfoundland. This is the common loon, and it's one that maybe some of you are familiar with already as a staple of Newfoundland ponds, maybe right by the cabin. You can hear the haunting call of the loon as it sort of yodels into the night. It's really quite beautiful. Loons are superficially duck-like because they're associated with water. They have a sort of duck-like shape, but if you take a look at the bill, you notice that it's really sharp and pointed, whereas if you think of a typical duck bill, that's really quite broad and flat. So the common loon has this sharp pointed bill. They do have a really bright red eye, and the males and females both look the same. They are black and white with a full black head and this white and black checkering on the back and white stripes on the neck. You'll see on the picture on the bottom when this loon is carrying around a chick. When the chicks hatch, they aren't able to thermoregulate yet. So they'll hop on the back of their parent and snuggle under the wing to stay warm as they go around. It's really quite cute if you get an opportunity to look at them. So loons are going to be found basically on the water all the time, except for when they're sitting on the nest, which will be very close to the water. Their legs are situated incredibly far back on their body, which means that they're very good at swimming and diving, but it means they're really bad at walking on land because their balance is just really face heavy. So they just like fall down on their face if they're not careful. So you'll mostly be seeing these birds on the water anytime you find them. There are some other loons that you might see out in the ocean in the winter, but they don't breed in Newfoundland. So the common loon is the one you'll see all summer long. Moving on to ducks. Most people are familiar with ducks as a general grouping. So these are, of course, a pretty large bird with a broad, flat bill. They have a thin neck and a small head on a large, sort of chunky body. They have large webbed feet, and they are associated with water, of course, but some of them do walk on land as well. I'll mention this free online guide. I'll send a link out to this in a follow-up email from this webinar, but this is called Ducks at a Distance. It's a waterfowl identification guide, and it's really good at depicting ducks in flight. It shows you some flocking and flying patterns. Sometimes you only see ducks when they're flying by and don't get really a chance to look at them when they're on the water. It also shows a close-up of the speculum, which is the area of the wing that has a bright colored patch on it. And that is pretty diagnostic for a lot of species. They'll have a different color or a different pattern on there. So that's something I'll touch on for the species we're going through tonight. And this guide has a good portrayal of those as well. Because it's actually a guide made for hunters, it also will tell you which ducks are good for eating or not. So if that's interesting to you, you could definitely check it out. So I will be showing in the pictures today males and females in breeding plumage, but it is important to note that throughout the year, ducks will also have an eclipse plumage. So on the top there, we have an adult male mallard. And the picture on the bottom, you have a female at the back and also an adult male mallard at the front, and he's in eclipse plumage in this picture. So basically twice a year, male ducks will molt all of their body feathers and go into this eclipse plumage, and basically they'll look like females at the time. So they do that during midsummer while the females are sitting on eggs. So if you see some female looking ducks, they could actually be a male in eclipse plumage during the summer. When we're talking about ducks as a grouping, you can split that further into two smaller groupings, and these are the dabbling ducks and the diving ducks. So the first thing you want to do when you see a duck or a group of ducks is to see if it is a dabbling or a diving duck. And I'll show you some pointers about these now. The first is that dabbling ducks are feeding at the surface of the water. So they're floating on the water, they're tipping their butts up in the air to get just a little bit under the water, or they're sort of feeding at the very top, looking for underwater plants or insects, and they're really not feeding very far under. Whereas diving ducks do exactly what they say, they dive straight under the water, and they feed more at the bottom of the body of water. So they'll disappear for a while and pop back up again. Dabbling ducks have their legs centered on their body, so they'll also be found walking around on land. If you're out at your local pond and all of the ducks are coming out because they want to get fed, those ones are going to be dabblers because they're walking on land. Diving ducks have their legs farther back on the body, kind of like the loon that I was mentioning. So they have a much harder time walking on land, but it does make them incredibly good at swimming and diving. Another thing is that dabbling ducks have pretty large wings for their body size, which means that if they're startled or taking off from the water, they can take off vertically. So they'll just burst up out of the water and be in the air. Whereas diving ducks, they have pretty small wings for their body size. So they need a bit of a runway when they take off, and you'll see them kind of running on top of the water before they actually get into the air. So those are diving ducks that are running on the water. And I should have mentioned with the loons, actually, of course, they also need to run on the water for quite a long time before they can get up into the air. And a last point that's probably a little tricky to tell unless you're comparing side by side is that dabbling ducks sit a little bit higher on the water. They're somewhat more buoyant than diving ducks who sit lower in the water. And that's because they need that extra weight to help them as they're diving down into the water. So we're going to go through the dabbling duck species first. Don't worry about the species that are the pictures that I've shown here. We're going to go through each of these species separately in a minute. So dabbling ducks are typically found in shallower bodies of water because that is where they can reach the food at the bottom if it's shallow, or they're in marshes and things like that because that's where they can reach the plants or the insects they're eating from the top and the bottom of the water. So we'll go through each of these species now. First, we have the wood duck. As you can see, this is a pretty striking duck. In all of my slides, I have a picture of the male as the main picture and a picture of the female with the female symbol more close to the bottom. So that's for all of the slides coming up. So the male wood duck here is pretty unmistakable. He has a really bright red eye ring and white borders sort of all around these striking colors on his body. And he has, as you'll notice on his head, this really long crest that he can raise and lower a little bit, but it's always shown there with the long feathers coming from the back of the head. The female, which is at the bottom, is a mottled brown color. She has a big white teardrop around her eye, And she has white edges on her primaries, which are the wing feathers that are tucked up by her tail. Both the male and the female wood duck have a speculum, which is that colorful patch on the wing that's dark blue, and it's bordered with a thin white stripe on the bottom. Wood ducks are aptly named, but very surprising because they actually nest in trees. So this is a duck that you could see sitting up in a tree. They nest in cavities that are either natural cavities in trees or in duck boxes that people can put up. And so the habitat that you'll find them breeding in is standing water that has trees surrounding it. In Newfoundland, we do see males around the island semi-frequently, but we don't really have a lot of breeding records for them here. We do have some from the Codroy Valley in southwestern Newfoundland. And a couple of years ago, we did have confirmation of a successful brood in Deer Lake. So that was really exciting. There's likely more wood ducks around than we think, and they just haven't been found. Moving on to the mallard. This is a pretty well-known duck and is quite common all across Canada. Mallards will sometimes stick around in the winter if there's open water. And they nest on the ground near ponds or in wetlands and even within towns and cities. So you can see mallards in your local parks if there's a pond there, or at your local water areas. The male is quite distinctive up here at the top. He has a bright green head, iridescent green head, and he has a bright yellow bill. If you look towards his tail, you'll see that he has these really curled tail feathers, and that's diagnostic for the mallard. There's no other duck that you'll find in Newfoundland that has that curled tail feathers, so that's a pretty good mark for them. The female down at the bottom there is mottled brown. You'll see this is a trend for most of the female ducks. They're mostly some sort of brown variation. The female mallard also has an orange and brown bill. The mallard's speculum, that color on the wing, is this bold blue with white bordering the top and the bottom. We'll move on to the American black duck. And the American black duck breeds throughout Eastern Canada, but they are pretty uncommon compared to the mallard in most places, other than Newfoundland, where they are actually more common than mallards. They also nest on the ground near ponds and wetlands, and they're also found in towns and cities. So this is another duck that you could find at your local pond or a section of open water this time of year. American black ducks are, the male and female look quite similar, other than the color of the bill. They're both a dark brown with some slight edging on the feathers, and they have a lighter brown or grayish colored head compared to the body. If you look at the bill color, the male at the back has an olive yellow bill, and the female at the front has a darker, more solid olive colored bill. So that can be tricky to tell when you're out looking at ducks, especially if you don't have really great lighting. A really good mark for telling a female mallard from American black ducks, since they can look quite similar, is that the speculum, that patch on the wing in the American black duck, is also blue, but it's bordered with black on both male and female, whereas the mallard, it was bordered by white. I'll also note that you can get a lot of hybridization between American black ducks and mallards. So you can get different individuals that have traits from both of the species, and it can really be quite confusing. You can have the bill color of one species and the plumage coloration of the other one. So just be aware of that. If you see a large dabbling duck that looks kind of confusing, like a mix of both, it's probably a mix of both. So don't be alarmed. Oh, and here I just have another picture where the speculum is showing a little bit better here on this American black duck. And you can see the black edging on around the blue instead of white that was on the mallard. Okay, we'll move on to the gadwall. This is another dabbling duck. It's around the same size as the black duck. It's a bit of a different color, as you can see. The male up at the top there is pretty gray overall. He has an extensive amount of black near his tail, and he also has a dark bill. The female at the bottom is a mottled brown again. She has an orange edge around a dark bill and a little bit of a dark smudge around her eye, but it's not too strong. If you see their wings stretched out, you'll see that both the males and females have a white speculum patch, but it's a little bit smaller on the female. So you can see that in the picture stretched out in the middle. The gadwall mostly breeds in Western North America in the prairies and grasslands. And it is rare in Newfoundland, but we do have records of breeding from the Corduroy Valley again. And these birds are also found nesting on the ground, always near water. And of course, they're eating aquatic plants and invertebrates. Here we have the northern pintail, and it's a pretty striking bird, the male in his breeding plumage. They're a little bit smaller than the mallard and American black duck, but the shape of them is a little bit different, where the northern pintail has this really long, slender neck. It's not quite as stocky, and it also has a long pin-shaped tail, like its name. So you can see the male has a dark brown head, a nice white stripe going down into its long neck, and a gray body and back. The hen at the bottom, the female, she is again mottled brown. She has a plain face with not a lot of markings on it, but you can see she has the same kind of shape as the male, with that really long, slender neck and a pretty slender bill. She doesn't, you'll note, have that fancy tail feather. In the northern pintail, the males have a green speculum, and the females have a bronzy kind of brown speculum. So these birds breed all across Newfoundland and all the way across Canada and into the Arctic. So they have quite a large range. In the past, they have been found breeding in several locations in Newfoundland, including Western as well as Northern Newfoundland. And they are also nesting on the ground in sparse grassy vegetation, in more open areas, so they're not looking for trees around. And sometimes they can be nesting quite far away from water. And then once the chicks hatch, the female will bring them all down to the local or the closest water source once they're walking around. Here's another species, the American widgeon. The American widgeon is again a little smaller than the American black duck. It has this really cool colored bill. Both the males and the females have this small blue-gray bill with that black tip on it. That's something to look for in this species. And you'll see that the male at the top there has kind of a brown head and body, but he has this really striking green stripe behind the eye that goes down the neck, and also a pale white or creamy forehead. And that creamy forehead is diagnostic for the American widgeon. You won't find another species in Newfoundland with that. The female on the bottom, she has a brown body with sort of a contrasting gray head, so she's not quite the same color along her whole body. And you'll note if you look at the eye that it's really quite dark around the eye. So if you see a female from a distance, you'll probably think that like her eye looks really dark. For the American widgeons, they have a green speculum and also a big white patch on the male that's above the speculum color. You could see it in that flying bird. In the female, that white patch is going to be smaller. Widgeons are found breeding near shallow lakes and marshes, and they're eating submerged vegetation. In Newfoundland, we have records only from the southwestern part of the island. And in wintertime, we also sometimes have the Eurasian widgeon that comes over from Europe. I'll show you it here. It's a bit blurry from around my house the other day. It was a little far, but this is the Eurasian widgeon, and you can see that the head color is different. It has a red head instead of a grayish brown head, and the forehead patch is more pinkish rather than that white that's on the American widgeon. But these ones are only around during the winter. But just if you see one that looks a little funny, it might be a Eurasian widgeon. We also have northern shovelers in Newfoundland. These are mostly found breeding in Western Newfoundland, or sorry, in Western North America. But we have had successful broods reported in the Codroy Valley again, and also Deer Lake. So this is another case where there might be more around than we think there are. They're nesting on the ground in grassy areas, and they are also sometimes far away from water. So the northern shoveler, if you take a look at both the male and the female, they have this really gigantic shovel-shaped bill, and that is the best clue for a northern shoveler, especially if you're looking from far away. So the male has a dark green iridescent head, a striking white sort of breast and belly, and then these really bright rusty chestnut patches on the side. Females, on the other hand, are again sort of mottled brown all over, but they have an orange bill, and that bill is the same shape and size as the giant bill of the male. If you get a chance to look at the wing of these ones, you'll see that they have a green speculum, both the males and the females, and you'll notice a powdery blue patch on the above the speculum on the males. It's not quite present in the females. This is a blue-winged teal. So it's another dabbling duck. It's quite a bit smaller than the others we've talked about so far. You would see a noticeable difference if you saw them side by side. The male is up here on the top, and you can see this really bright white crescent along his face behind his bill, and that's pretty diagnostic for the blue-winged teal. The rest of his body is a bit darker with those like paler brown sides, and they have a dark bill. The female on the bottom, again, a mottled brown, but she has sort of a dark line through her eye, as well as white around the eye. If you get a good close-up look, you'd be able to see that. And if you take a look at the base of the bill, it has a little bit of a paler section down there. Again, hard to tell these clues if you don't have a really good look. And sometimes you might just not be able to tell what species you have, especially for females, and that's okay. So they're really tricky. The speculum color of the males is green, and they have a powdery blue patch above as well, if you see them flying. The blue-winged teal nests in wetlands, shallow marshes, and temporary ponds, so they'll actually move their breeding locations around every year depending on where the standing water is. And in Newfoundland, we found them breeding in southwestern Newfoundland, but also on the Avalon Peninsula. This is our last dabbling duck of the evening. This is the green-winged teal, and it's also the smallest dabbling duck that you'll find in Newfoundland. They're probably only around half the size of a mallard or American black duck, so they're really quite tiny. If you've been out and seen a bunch of ducks together and thought, oh look, there's a baby duck there, that it looks still like an adult, but it's really tiny, it was probably a green-winged teal. They're really, really small. The male up on the top there has this nice chestnut head, but he has a green streak behind the eye that goes down the neck. And if you look at the arrow there, he has a white spur along the side, on both sides. And the rest of the body is gray. Down at the bottom, the female again, mottled brown, but she has a bit of a darker cap on top of her head. And compared to the blue-winged teal that we saw just on the last slide, she doesn't have any white around her eye. And the base of the bill doesn't really have that same pale section that we saw before in the blue-winged teal. Since they are called the green-winged teal, they're aptly named because both the males and females do have a green speculum, and it's quite bright and brilliant. And you could see it poking out from the female floating here. And so that's a really good thing to look for. If you see a little tiny duck and it has a little green patch, you found yourself a green-winged teal. These birds are breeding in shallow permanent ponds, so they're not moving locations each year probably. And these are often found near forests rather than in open areas. And some do stick around in the winter in Newfoundland, so you might see them even now. And in the summer, they're usually feeding on seeds that are picked from the surface of the water or the mud, as well as invertebrates and tadpoles. I'll just ask everybody again to mute themselves if they don't mind, just so I'm getting a bit of background noise. I'll just go through a couple of species that have similarities to compare them. So we had a couple that had, of ducks that had green heads. So that was the mallard and the northern shoveler, and I have them both here. Catherine, you muted me.
Sorry, Jenna, I was trying to be proactive, but it did not work out the way I planned.
That's okay. Yeah, so we have the mallard and the northern shoveler. They both have a iridescent green head. But you'll notice if you take a look at the bill, they're very different. The mallard has that bright yellow bill, and the northern shoveler has that really large, like shovel-shaped black bill. So if you take a look at that, you'll see the difference. And also the coloration of the body is different, with the mallard having a gray body with a chestnut breast, and the northern shoveler having a bright white body with those rusty flanks. And then I'll also draw your attention to the little curly feather at the tail of the mallard, which I think is fun to find and a good marker for them. And then we also had a couple of ducks with a green stripe behind their eye, and that was the American widgeon and the green-winged teal. So the American widgeon has also that white patch on the forehead, if you remember, and their bill is blue-gray with a black tip, whereas the green-winged teal has an all-black bill, and it's quite a bit larger actually if you look at the size of the bill compared to his head. And the green-winged teal has a white spur on their side. So the location of the white on the American widgeon and the green-winged teal is different, and their bill is quite different as well. So that brings us through the dabbling ducks. We're going to move on now to the diving ducks. A few fun facts about diving ducks is that they typically are going to be underwater for around 10 to 30 seconds, but they can actually stay underwater for a minute or more. So if you see one going under and you can't find where it is, you might just have to wait a little longer for them to pop up. They can stay underwater for so long because they have a high tolerance for asphyxia, which is the lack of air. And when they're diving, they ration their oxygen just to their vital tissues and organs, rather than wasting that oxygen on other areas of the body that aren't as important. They also reduce their heart rate when they're underwater to use less oxygen. And these reactions are prompted when water hits a certain receptor in their nostrils as they dive. When they're wanting to come back up and they're finished diving, all they need to do is stop paddling their feet and they'll just pop right back up like a cork. So you'll just see them pop out of the water again and get ready for the next dive. So we have diving ducks that hunt sedentary prey, prey that doesn't move, and those are things like clams. So they'll dive down and pop back up in the same location. And we also have diving ducks that are hunting mobile prey like fish. And so those will dive under and you'll see them pop up in a different location. And those are mergansers. We'll get to them near the end. I'll go through all of these species right now, so don't worry about those pictures there. We'll start with the ring-necked duck. The ring-necked duck is probably one of the more common ones you're going to see across the island throughout the summer. They are nesting usually in shallow marshes or small ponds that have forest around the edges. And they actually construct their nest on top of the water using floating vegetation. So if the water levels change throughout the summer, they'll have to construct that nest and fix it up over the summer, which is interesting, I think. So they are found all across the island. You might wonder why they're called the ring-necked duck. And if you look at the small picture on the top left, you'll see that they do have a ring around their neck, but usually you're not going to see that ring. They have to be at a very specific posture and with very specific lighting to see the ring that's on their neck. I think they should have been called the ring-billed duck because they do have a white ring around the base of the bill, the tip of the bill. And that's in both the males and the females. And you can typically see that at least from a fair distance away. The ring-necked duck is fully black and white. They're white on the underside and black on the head and across the back. And they also have this bright yellow eye. The female, down at the bottom, she is gray, or sorry, brown, like most of the ducks we've seen. And she has a bit of white around her eye, and she also has a pale section at the base of the bill. And so those are important things to look at when you're looking at female ring-necked ducks. For the diving ducks, their speculums aren't really as brightly colored as the dabbling ducks, so it's not quite as useful to look at the colors there, but I still have them down the corner out of interest. We're getting into a fair few ducks that look pretty similar. This is the lesser scaup. As you can see, the male also has this dark black head and breast, as well as tail, and a bright yellow eye. But if you look at the middle of the body, he has gray on the back, gray mottling, and a white side. Whereas the ring-necked duck that we just saw on the last slide had a black back rather than a gray back. On the bottom, we have the female again. She is brown, and she has that bold white patch at the base of her bill. When we go to the next slide, keep an eye on that patch on the next bird, and we'll compare the two. The lesser scaup, we don't have any breeding records of lesser scaup in Newfoundland yet, but there is some potential for it, which is why I've included them here. They also nest on the ground close to deep permanent wetlands that have a lot of vegetation in them. And the scaup are diving for clams and plants. So they'd be popping up in the same location they dove down. Okay, this is the greater scaup. It looks nearly the exact same, doesn't it? Again, we have the black head and breast and the black tail, gray on the back and white on the sides for the male. And the female at the bottom here is brown. And if you look at the white around her bill, it goes all the way around as if she dipped her whole bill into some like white powder rather than just having a little section above the top. These are tricky pointers, especially for the female ducks. And sometimes you won't know if it's a greater or lesser scaup. A lot of the time you might not know. In Newfoundland, greater scaup are much more common. So it's the more likely species you'll see. But sometimes you just can't tell. And you know it's a scaup and that's all. And that happens to everybody, even people who've been studying birds for a long, long time. We have had greater scaup breeding in the southern Avalon Peninsula, the Burin Peninsula, and also the West Coast. So they are, as I said, a bit more common than the lesser scaup, and they're nesting in long grasses on the edge of fresh water. So they're also not using really the forests. Here we'll just compare the greater and lesser scaup. And the biggest pointer for telling these two species apart for the males is the shape of their head. And this is a really difficult cue to be able to see in the field, and it takes a lot of practice. As I said, the greater scaup is more common, so you usually can default to greater, but this is something to try and pay attention to, is that for the lesser scaup, the highest point is a peak at the back of the head. So you can see it has like almost a little bit of a crest there, which is maybe not always quite as visible, but it has a little higher section at the back of the head. Whereas the greater scaup has really a rounded head where the highest point of the head is in the middle or at the front. And I understand that is very difficult to tell apart, and it just takes a lot of practice. In a completely different looking duck, we have the common eider, refreshingly different. This is a really large, heavy diving duck. The common eider is where eider down comforters or duvets come from. It comes from the feathers of these birds. So basically what happens is during breeding season, females will pluck downy feathers from their breast and line the nest with them to keep the nestlings warm and the eggs warm. And there's actually eider farms in mostly Iceland, I think, where farmers will collect the down from the nests once the nesting season is over. So that's where all of these eider down blankets have come from in the past. Eiders do nest in colonies, almost like a seabird, and they're found along all of the coast of Newfoundland, especially on offshore islands. You can get big colonies of eiders. In the wintertime, we can also see king eiders, but I didn't include them on this slide here. If you're interested, you can take a look at a bird book or online. But the common eider has this really distinctive sloped forehead, where the head and the bill sort of slope together rather than having a distinct head shape with a bill sticking out. And they do have this like prominent yellow-orange bill that's really quite vibrantly colored. So that's the male on the top, and the rest of his body is this striking white and black. The female is on the bottom left there, and she's brown, as we might have expected. But you can still see that shape of the bill going up to the forehead is the same as the male, and that's a really good pointer to look for eiders. Onto another striking duck is the harlequin duck. The harlequin duck is pretty small and a diving duck again. It has a bit of a different shape because it has a bit of a thicker neck compared to some of the others. And so it doesn't look quite as ill proportioned for its body. As you can see, the male at the top there has these beautiful striking colors. He's slate blue overall with these precise white patterns all over, and this big rusty patch on his flank and on the top of his head. Sometimes if you're not really close enough, you won't get a look at all these colors as well. He'll look mostly just dark, but you'll always see those white patches standing out in that pattern. So that's something to keep an eye out for. You'll also notice that he has a really small bill and also a bit of a longer tail than some of the other ducks we've been looking at. The female down at the bottom there is brown, but if you look at the patterns on her face, you'll see that she has a bright white spot behind her eye and also a paler patch in front of the eye behind the bill. So that's something to look for with harlequin ducks. These are a little bit harder to find because in the summer times, they actually breed near fast-moving rocky streams. So these are often quite far inland. There's some known to be in the Northern Peninsula and some rocky bays on the south coast, but they are in these like very rapid-filled rivers when they're breeding. Here we have the long-tailed duck. This is another diving duck. Most people are actually familiar with the winter plumage, which is down at the bottom right. But you can see in both the winter and summer, they have this really long feather coming at the bottom of coming at the tail. And the summer breeding plumage male up at the top there is really, I think, quite a funny looking bird, with those like white tufted feathers on the top of the head, almost like a little toupee, a bright colored patch on his bill, and this white patch on his face. The female, on the other hand, is quite cryptic. You can see her on the bottom there. When they're nesting, she'll be brown to blend in with the grasses that they nest in, but she has a big white patch on her face as well. Long-tailed ducks are not only found in Newfoundland, they're actually found all across the world in the polar regions. And they are pretty rare in Newfoundland, but they do breed regularly in the long-range mountains, up at the tops of the long-range mountains. So this is another species where there could be more of them than we know, just they haven't been found because they would be in quite remote areas. We'll move on now to a couple of different species of scoters. This is the surf scoter. We don't have any records of breeding for the surf scoter in Newfoundland, but it is possible, which is why I've included it. And they nest in wooded areas near shallow freshwater, like ponds, bogs, or tundra. So again, they could be found in places that people just aren't frequenting very often in the summers. In the winter, you'll find them offshore, floating around the ocean. So surf scoters also have a really interesting bill. It's a large knobbly bill, and it also slopes up to the forehead a little bit like the eider, but it's quite differently colored. And you'll see the male up at the top there is all black on his body except for a bright white patch on his forehead and a white patch on the back of the neck. The female down at the bottom left is brown, and she has a white spot behind the bill and a white spot behind the eye. And you can see just some males and females floating along the bottom there. So you can see, like from far away, you could still pick out where the white patches are in that bill. We also have black scoters in Newfoundland. The males in this picture are the ones that are all black with that really bright yellow patch on top of the bill. The females are brown with a pale section on the face that goes down the neck. Black scoters only were, the first breeding record for black scoters in Newfoundland was actually just a couple of years ago in the long range mountains. So this is another species that is likely found a little bit more than we expect they are, just in sort of remote areas where people aren't looking for them as much. So if you ever find one when you're out and about, definitely let us know. They'll be found nesting in large clumps of grass in more open areas. And they're eating small fish, usually plants and crustaceans that they find in the body of water that they're breeding near. In the wintertime, we actually have another species of scoter that you can see out in the ocean. If you have a group of scoters together, that's the white-winged scoter. And again, you can look that up if you want to take a look at what that bird looks like. Okay, we're moving on to a couple of species of goldeneye. This is the common goldeneye. It's another diving duck that has, as you can see, this really dark head, a dark back. It's sort of iridescent, but you'll notice that the male has that really bright white patch on his face and a bright golden eye. Thankfully, his name says he's a golden eye. And the rest of his body is white. The female at the bottom has a brown head on more of a gray body. So there's a bit of contrast there in comparison to some of the other ducks we've seen. And these birds are another one that nests in cavities. So they need to have forest around the water body. They go to the same cavity year after year. So they're using typically old woodpecker holes or nest boxes put up by people, sometimes natural tree cavities that are big enough. And they are using a cavity that's near a deep lake or a pond. because they are diving down to get the water insects. The next bird is the Barrow's goldeneye. As you can see, it looks quite similar to the common goldeneye I just showed you. The Barrow's goldeneye is quite uncommon compared to the common goldeneye. It is a species at risk, and it's not actually known to breed in Newfoundland, but there is potential for it, especially in the Long Range Mountains. So I've included it again. These birds are nesting in the same sort of areas as common goldeneyes, in wooded areas near a lake or pond, using a tree cavity in the same way that the common goldeneye did. So when both of these species are flying, you can actually hear their wings whistling, which is cool. And they'll often go back to the same area to nest year after year. When we look at the male here, you'll see again, he has that bright golden eye. He's got a white patch on his face behind the bill, and he has a white belly as well as a dark back. But he has white little patches on the back, and also this dark spur that comes down near the shoulder. The female down at the bottom has a gray body and a brown head again, and a mostly yellow bill. The two species, the common goldeneye and Barrow's goldeneye, females are really difficult to tell apart again, but the males are a little bit easier. And I have them here to compare. So the common goldeneye there on the left, we're going to be comparing the shape of the white on the face. So the common goldeneye has a circular patch behind the bill of white, and the Barrow's goldeneye has a crescent-shaped patch of white behind the bill. And those shapes will be evident if you can get a close enough look at their face. If you can only get a look at their body, then you'll see that the common goldeneye has much more white on his side than the Barrow's goldeneye. The black extends much farther on the Barrow's goldeneye. And so the amount of white that's showing up there is more in circles on the Barrow's goldeneye's back, and it's more just streaks on the common goldeneye. Additionally, the Barrow's goldeneye does have that black streak, black spur that goes down along the shoulder. If you see them flying, the Barrow's goldeneye on the left here has a little bit less white in the wing than the common goldeneye. It might be hard to see unless you're getting a really, really good look at their wing when they're flying, but something to be aware of if you're trying to tell the difference. Okay, we're heading into the mergansers now. And mergansers are another type of duck. Despite how their bill looks different, they have this really thin saw-like bill. That's a merganser trait, but they are a diving duck. They feed on fish, so they're ones that are going to be diving underwater and popping up in a different location because they're chasing fish around underwater. And this hooded merganser that we have here, we don't actually have any breeding records for Newfoundland, but again, it's a potential thing where males have been seen in the summer when females would typically been sitting on a nest. So they could be breeding on the island, and we just haven't discovered it yet. This is another bird that's actually nesting in cavities in forested wetlands. So it's another one you'll see in the woods. Really strange to think about, but there we go. The hooded merganser gets its name, of course, because of this huge hood that the male has on his head, with the white patch in the middle. The very small picture on the top left, you can see sometimes he has that flattened down, so it gives him a bit of a different shape on his head. So just watch out for that if you're looking at a bird that looks like this one. And otherwise, he has black on his back and brown on his sides. The female down at the bottom is brownish gray all over, but she has that same sort of mohawk or hooded crest on her head. This is the red-breasted merganser, and it's definitely more common than the hooded merganser in Newfoundland. They are, again, a diving duck. They have that same shape of the bill that we saw just now, the merganser-shaped bill. It's a bright red bill. And the male also has a bright red eye as well. The red-breasted mergansers have this really long, shaggy crest on their back, on the back of their head. But if it's wet or flattened down a little bit, it's a little bit harder to tell. So just be careful about that. And so the male has this iridescent green head, a brown breast, gray on his sides, and black on the back. The female down at the bottom there, she has a gray-brown body and a brown head. And if you take a careful look at the neck area, you'll see that the gray color of the body and the brown color of the head sort of meld seamlessly into each other without any major contrast. Just keep that in mind as we go to the next bird. But before we do, I'll just mention that the red-breasted merganser nests on the ground instead of in a tree, in marshes, along forested riverbanks, rocky or vegetated islands, and females actually will lay their eggs in other species' nests, and others will also lay their eggs in her nest. So it's a bit of an interesting species. Okay, we also have the common merganser, and this is, I think, our last duck we're going through today. The common merganser, again, has that bill shape that we've talked about being diagnostic for mergansers. It's really thin, thin and red. And the male, which is on the right there, is a black and white duck, black on the head and back and white underneath. But again, with that merganser bill, you can sort of tell the difference between the other black and white ducks we were talking about. The female on the left there, she has a gray body and a brown head, like we talked about with the red-breasted merganser just now. But just take a look at the neck there, and you'll see there's a really distinct difference between the brown of the head and the gray of the body. There's that really distinct line. And that's how you'll tell the female common merganser and red-breasted merganser apart. And she'll also have this white patch on her chin. You'll see a cute little picture at the bottom. This is another species that carries their young around on their back. And I just think that's the cutest thing. Also note that the female does have some of that crest on the back of her head. So looking at a crest for the red-breasted and common merganser to tell the difference isn't necessarily the best marker. You should definitely take a look at the neck pattern there instead. Okay, so that was the last species. I'm just going to talk about this, where's the white, because you're probably thoroughly overwhelmed with ducks at this point. With time, you'll definitely pick up on differences that are pretty subtle, but it does take practice, of course. Where's the white is a really good tool because ducks are often farther away, not in great lighting, kind of harder to see with like the glare sometimes, but you can usually tell, even if you can't see the colors of their head or feathers, you can usually tell where the white patch is on their body. And for most of these ducks we've seen today, the white is in a different spot. So for example, we have the green-winged teal here, northern shoveler, and American widgeon, and they all have very distinctive different patches of white. So that's something to definitely keep an eye out for if you're just seeing a bunch of ducks in the water and you're not really sure what colors they are, and it's hard to tell the shape. Maybe take a look at where the white is. And then I'll just make a note about identifying female ducks, because as we saw today, and as you can see in this slide, a lot of them look very, very similar at a passing glance. And if you haven't had a lot of time to study them or a lot of occasion to see them out in the wild, they can be really overwhelming. So things to look at for female ducks is take a look at the shape from the males. There's often pairs that are swimming together. You can compare the male and the female to take a look at the shape, where we're talking about the size of the head, the shape of the head, the shape of the neck, and also be sure to take a look at the patterns on the head. So we've talked about sort of where white patches are on their faces, where lines are on their faces, where dark patches are on their faces. Take a look at that. And also when you have occasion to see their wing, you can always take a look at the speculum coloration. Sometimes you can identify a female duck, and that's okay. You can usually get it down to whether it's a diving duck or a dabbling duck at the very least. And again, this is something that will come with time and practice. And speaking of practice, let's get into our quick little quiz. This is a no pressure quiz, of course. I'm going to open a poll, and so you can just pick which species you think this is. There'll be some options here, and I think it should be open. Maybe. So what species? Oh, maybe it's not open.
I'm not seeing a poll, Jenna.
It's not working. Okay.
Oh, no, I got it. I think you have to click on the polls at the bottom, and it should pop up. So give that a try.
Oh, it's maybe not working.
In the across the bottom, you should have little icons. One of them says polls. So just try clicking on that. I did that and it popped up. You don't have a poll option.
Okay, if people aren't seeing the poll, I'll give you a few options of what species this is, and you can type it into the chat. Do you think this is a greater scaup, a common merganser, a common eider, or a common goldeneye? Oh, I saw.
Okay, I got the poll to work, Jenna.
Okay.
So you should be able to answer the poll now.
Yeah, people are answering the poll. Okay, we won't leave it open for too long since we're already at an hour here. But we've got a lot of answers coming in, and so far most people are thinking it's a common merganser, and that is in fact correct. This is a common merganser, and that's because we are taking a look at that bill that's really thin, merganser shape like we were talking about. The common eider has a really bright yellow bill that slopes up the forehead, and the greater scaup had a bright yellow eye and black all along the front and the tail. So that's tricky. Okay, let's see if I can get the next one to work. Okay, so here's the next species. Okay. Can you see this poll? Looks like yes, because there's answers coming in.
Yep, that one popped right up. I figured out where we went wrong, so we won't do it again. I don't think.
Perfect.
We may do something else, but we won't.
We might do something different wrong. Okay, we've got some answers coming in. I'll close it down in a second here. We have a resounding collection of people saying this is a green-winged teal, and yes, that is right. And there is the perfect little green speculum showing, which is fantastic for this species, as well as that green stripe behind the eye. So the American widgeon also had the green stripe behind the eye, but it had that pale section on the forehead as well. And mallard has a fully green head, and the gadwall is sort of all gray with none of that green on the face either. Okay, let's move along to our next one. Okay, this is our next species. It's a tricky one. Just leave it for not too long here. Okay, I'm going to close it down. And most people thought, 83% thought it was a greater scaup. And yes, that is correct. So this was a hard one because we have a lot of these ducks that are black and white, and also with a golden colored eye, which would indicate a common golden eye as well. But we're looking for this one at that gray on the back as well. So the ring-necked duck will have black along the back. The common golden eye will also have black along the back. Wow, I'm forgetting what they look like right now after all of this. But the greater scaup, yes, is perfect. The lesser scaup, again, looks nearly the exact same, but has a little bit of a different shaped head. And I left it out of the options for a reason. Okay, here's another species. Second last one. Who do you think this is? Just leave that for a second here. We're getting 2 answers coming in. Okay, I'm going to close it down. So this is, oops, a ring-necked duck. We had 2 options here that people answered. The ring-necked duck, as I like to say, the ring-billed duck, because of that white ring around the bill. It has a golden eye, like the common golden eye, but the common golden eye has a big white patch on the face behind the bill, whereas this guy has a fully black head. And good job eliminating the greater scaup that we just had a question about, because this has a fully black back instead of gray. Okay, we'll just do our final one here. Which species is this? Getting a lot of answers coming in quickly here. So I'm going to close it down because we have a full consensus that this is a mallard. So that's great, because that means that even with all of the difficult species, we always have the mallard here, who is quite distinctive looking. So if you're seeing these birds out and about with little chicks, you can be sure to know what species they are, and let us know for the atlas if you're interested. Okay, so that was the end for tonight. Thank you everybody for sticking it out a little bit late here, and I hope that you feel a little more comfortable with your ducks now, or have some of the skills to try and start telling them apart. Always be patient with yourself when you're learning these difficult species. You can feel free to reach out to us with any questions about birds or any of our programs that I talked about, or follow our social media. And I can definitely answer some questions now if anybody has any coming in or that came in earlier. Yeah, and thank you everybody again for coming out tonight.
Thank you, Jenna. You did a great job as always. I've been manning the chat, and mostly what's coming in now are many, many thanks. People saying what a great job you did, and lots of people observing that you have some awesome photos. Wendy, there is a webinar next week. Next week, I believe, is shorebirds and game birds. So hopefully should be another fun-filled, interesting one. I love those little ptarmigan. They're among my favorite birds. We did have some questions earlier in the presentation, which I've been doing my best to answer, but you may be able to contribute opinion or knowledge that I don't have. So I'm trying to scroll back here. Okay. Do you have a way of distinguishing? So as you said, ducks are often tricky, particularly in bad lighting. That can make things really challenging. And do you have any tips for distinguishing between black ducks and gadwall when they're on the water and the lighting is terrible? The only tip I have is that gadwall technically have thinner bills than black ducks and mallards, but you know, they also kind of have a different shaped head, but I would find that one very tricky. I just wondered if you had any tips there.
Yeah, I mean, same as anybody. When the lighting's bad, I struggle with my ducks, to be honest. So I don't have any great tip for that, unfortunately. Sometimes it helps to like get to their other side if there's like sun shining in one direction and you can actually get some more color coming out. But if it's like just dull out and there's no good lighting, then sometimes you just won't be able to ID them and hope they're back again tomorrow with better light, maybe.
Absolutely. Brianna wanted to know if there was a known purpose for the long, slim tail in male northern pintails, and I said that my guess was that it's a sexual signal, so a signal to potential mates. But I did do a little bit of rapid Googling and searching scientific databases, and there is evidence that females do pay attention to things about plumage, but it's not the tail as you would expect. It seems to be white breast feathers and how colorful their scapular, so their like shoulder blade feathers are, as opposed to the long tail. Either nobody's actually looked at whether the long tail makes a difference, or I don't know. Jenna, do you know anything about the purpose of the pintail?
I'm afraid to say I don't have any extra information than what you found just now. But someone should find out, I think, for
yeah,
us.
right? Absolutely. Okay. I'm going back through the questions. I think I got most of them as we were going through. Oh, Scott wanted to know whether there was any difference in clutch survival in Newfoundland versus mainland that could be attributed to a lack of predatory freshwater fish species like the northern pike. I don't know if you were referring to a specific species there, Scott. So if you're still here and you can tell us what species you were talking about there, that would be super helpful. Not sure when that came in.
That's an interesting question, though, and I don't personally know anything about it. But I mean, I know in Ontario, even loon chicks are often taken also by snapping turtles and things like that. And we don't have really the predatory fish species or other species like snapping turtles in Newfoundland that would be snapping up ducklings from underneath the water. So that's an interesting question. Sadly, I don't have an answer for that
either. Scott said pike and muskie eat lots of ducklings, so maybe it was not a specific species question, it was just a general question. So in Manitoba and Northwest Ontario, they eat lots, yeah, it was general, so they eat lots of ducklings.
Yeah, but that would be really interesting to find out, though.
Yes, and Paul observed that there is a color difference between the gadwall and the black duck, and this is absolutely true, but sometimes in terrible lighting conditions, particularly when you're looking at female ducks, which, as Jenna sort of repeated tonight, are often just mottled brown, it can make things challenging. Okay, I may have missed things there. Things were moving really fast in the chat, but I'm not seeing anything else. If you have a question and I missed it, feel free to put it in the chat again.
Or unmute yourself and let us know for sure.
That would be easy too. Yeah.
Yeah. If there are no other questions.
Oh, we got another one. Yeah.
Oh, we have one. Yeah.
Mercury poison in fish is affecting loons, and do we see that in loons on Newfoundland? I don't know. Do we have much information about studies of mercury here in Newfoundland, Jenna?
Not that I know of, and a lot of that information has come actually from, I think, the Loon Lake Loon Survey.
Canadian Lakes Loon Survey.
Yes,
which Canada does. Yes,
which is another Birds Canada program, and I don't think there's a lot of people who are involved in that in Newfoundland. That's another program that you could get involved in Newfoundland if you were interested.
And should if you have a cabin on a lake.
And yes, if you're often watching loons by your cabin at the pond, then it's great information to have. But I think we just don't have that information for Newfoundland so far.
And Ellie said that they're guessing buffleheads don't breed in Newfoundland then.
That's correct. No buffleheads in Newfoundland. Sadly, because they're really funny little guys.
And somebody pointed out that mercury could be associated with the hydroelectric developments in Labrador. That's totally true. We certainly know that some of the storm petrels are having issues with mercury, but of course they forage quite far away from, the island itself. So, do tufted ducks breed in Newfoundland? So we have tufted ducks, certainly reliably in St. John's in the winter. We don't really have them in the summer. They don't really breed here, although I was just checking on eBird, and it seems that there were a couple that stuck around in Bowring Park last summer, but generally no, tufted ducks do not breed in Newfoundland. Okay. I think I got it all again. Things are moving fast in the chat, Jenna.
Yeah. Well, thanks for going through all those.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. Okay, things have slowed down, so I think yeah, we'll call it a night and hope to see some of you out again next week.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you again, Jenna. Great job.
Thanks, Catherine.